As you know, Michael, this past year I've compared higher ed to a living organism that is now at the end of its conservation cycle, readying for that next cycle when it begins to reorganize.
And that reorganization, Jeff, we got to start to see the beginnings of that as we took the podcast on the road this fall, where we recorded 2 live episodes, one at Butler in Indianapolis and one at Adobe's headquarters in Silicon Valley, to talk about both AI and innovation. Now, you and I didn't have a chance to really debrief from those visits, so we'll take some time to do that today. Plus, there are a few headlines, as usual, to discuss in higher ed. And hey, we're about to head into 2026, so it's time for some predictions sure to go wrong. That's all ahead on Future You.
With Adobe Solutions for Higher Education, you can engage students for better learning outcomes. Give them in-demand, creative, and AI skills for career success, and drive enrollment with innovation. Learn more at adobeforeducation.com. Located in Indianapolis, Butler University is nationally recognized for hands-on, future-focused learning and a 98% placement rate. With programs that connect classrooms to careers, Butler prepares graduates to lead with purpose. Learn more at butler.edu. This episode of Future You is sponsored by Ascendium, a mission-driven nonprofit committed to improving learning and training systems to better serve learners from low-income backgrounds. For more information, visit ascendiumphilanthropy.org. Subscribe to Future You wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoy the show, share it with your friends so others can discover the conversations we're having about higher education.
I'm Jeff Salingo.
And I'm Michael Horn.
Michael, we logged a lot of miles this fall for the podcast, but often, as you know, we were kind of ships passing in the night, even if we were together in person, because I was either coming or going on the book tour. So I thought, let's take the first half of this show to talk about 2 of my favorite episodes from this fall, and those were live recordings we did at Butler and Adobe.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jeff, it's just great to be on campus in the case of Butler, and then with Adobe, right? We were with all these faculty members who were attending the conference, obviously thinking very deeply about how AI is going to impact their work. And I thought both conversations were incredibly illuminating. I actually kind of felt like I got to say a lot of my piece, if you will, out of the Butler University one. But one thing that did strike me that I just wanted to come back to is the amount of energy that leadership team has around innovation, and how clearly they defined the moment that they were facing as a threat when President Danko, came into the presidency, right? And we talked about this on the podcast, Dual Transformation, Clark Gilbert's work, et cetera. But I just think a lot of leadership at a lot of colleges and universities are a bit still in denial right now. We're going to come back and talk about this a little bit in the second half, but still a little bit in denial about some of the structural challenges that they're facing. And for Butler to say, no, we're not going to be in denial about that. We're going to face it head on and see it as an opportunity to innovate. Look, there's still a lot of work I'm sure that they have to do there, right? That they're launching another strategic plan as we were there, which was neat to be a part of as well. But, I think it's refreshing to see a school treat it as it is and then go out and attack it. What jumped out to you?
Yeah, so I want to tell you what jumped out at me, and then I want to kind of circle back because you were there in the very early days of that Butler transformation, and maybe you could give some thoughts on how you saw it now at the midpoint, maybe, or near the end, at least, of this first strategic plan. So there were a couple of things that really struck me during that recording. One was this idea of massive experimentation. And this is something, by the way, that Georgia State did with Mark Becker when he first got there. Let's just, in some ways, it's a lot of what ASU does. Just let's do a bunch of small experiments that are easy to carry out, that are not that expensive. Butler used this $1 million gift to invest in a bunch of ideas. I think it's a great use of a gift like that. And then scale those that work. right? So they dipped their toe, as President Danko told us, dipped their toe into online education. And then they ended up taking this deeper dive pretty quickly with a few dozen online courses. And as he said something that was really critical, I think. It really put into the bloodstream, as he said, that change is a good thing. It got the institution used to change. So I think that was one. Experiment, then scale. The other one was, as he said, hire slowly and fire quickly. And I think that new presidents are often reluctant to put the right team in place. They want to kind of figure out who their people are first. And as he said, he was told on the way in the door who was working and who wasn't, and he figured that out pretty quickly. And as he said, get the right people and then empower them, set them free. I think that a lot of senior leaders are often not empowered to do the things that the president sets out. So
just stay on that one. I couldn't agree more with you, Jeff, on that. No, I think we said it at the podcast. No one ever said, "Oh, we fired too quickly." That just doesn't happen. But the tendency, I agree, is just to sit on folks, and then you have this messy sort of limbo stage, right? Where they're not fully empowered because you don't fully trust them, and vice versa. They're not your people, so they're not necessarily executing on the things that you really need to. And the core thing for any leader coming into a presidency is get the right leadership team, the right cabinet around you, I think is critical.
Yeah, and the other thing I liked, Michael, is that he drew on the expertise of shared governance. I think we hear so many presidents complain and boards complain about shared governance. It kind of is a feature of higher ed, and you kind of have to put up with it often. But he, as he talked about, he drew on the expertise not only of the board, but also of the faculty. And as he said, there were always going to be dissenters among the faculty, but he figured out who among the faculty, who among the deans could be helpful to him, and then drew on that expertise. And then finally, the thing that really stuck with me was what I would call integrity and consistency. Going back to that idea of shared governance, as he said, there will always be loud voices of dissent. You kind of have to listen to them and decide a path forward. But there was this tenacity about President Danko that I saw in him, that he was just really committed to the work. We know with many short-term presidents that we've met over the years, as they were like looking to grab kind of low-hanging fruit in order to move on to their next job. If the campus knows you're going to do that, they're going to just kind of wait you out.
Yeah. That's a great point. And
so I was kind of curious because Melissa referenced it in our second part of that episode where we had the panel. Melissa Beckwith, who's the head of innovation there and strategic initiatives at Butler, mentioned talking to you while they were putting together this original plan. So you've seen it come a little bit of full circle. She talked about the grade she would give them. I'm kind of curious about what you thought from seeing those early seeds.
Yeah, well, I want to actually relate it to the shared governance point you brought up, because I think one of the big things that at the time I was, working with Entangled, we were supporting Butler and Melissa. And I guess what I would call, Jeff, is the big thing we were saying is how do we get shared governance to work for you rather than against you? In other words, how do you embed these processes around innovation so you can actually build a deeper culture and rhythm around innovation where, just as you said, like constantly looking at small things, trying it out, sunsetting them if it doesn't work. If the experiments do work, how do we actually invest more in them? And creating process around that. So actually your shared governance, the processes that everyone complains about, how do you actually build transparent processes so that they aid your innovation and your growth strategies? And frankly, you can have a leg up, I think, I would argue, on corporate America in this regard, right? Because in some ways, like they don't want to see those processes. Like it's kind of, they would consider that bureaucracy. Actually, that emphasis on process, as long as some of it is explicitly around the creation of new ideas, and then not just the creation. And because let's be honest, there's tons of innovative faculty members in higher ed doing really cool stuff, but they just stay as islands. There's no institutional way to take the experiments that are really working that would be strategically important to the university in a systematic way and then fund them as they could grow. And essentially that's how I see what Butler has created, right? Is a process to do that systematically and bank on growth. And so we'll see how that plays out. They're certainly investing a lot in that. I think there is a question, just to be transparent, as they manage the finances, are they getting the right balance of making sure you're still positive cash flow and investing in these growth initiatives, and you're not banking too much one way or the other on that. That's a balance that I think that they're going to have to navigate, I imagine, in the years ahead. So those are my reflections, but I really admire how they built it into the culture itself. And I'll make one other observation, because I've heard you say, well, it's cool to see something that is not about autonomy, right? It's not a separate thing. And I think that's right, because Butler, the ventures that they've funded are not about reinventing or displacing the business model. They're about leveraging their existing model. And there you don't need full autonomy. It's not like a Southern New Hampshire with Southern New Hampshire online play, right? Or some of the other things we know are happening in the AI universe right now at certain universities, right? Where they really need to do something separate and keep it separate. I think what they've chosen are largely things that build on what Butler has today. They are not fundamentally about displacing it. And we'll see, is that the right strategy? But at least they've been coherent and clear about it, I think.
Yeah, and one thing that was cool to me, Michael, is that we tend to talk about, the ASUs of the world, the WGUs of the world, the Southern New Hampshires of the world. These are huge places, right? These mega universities. It was kind of cool for me to see, what is really kind of the backbone of American higher education, these mid-size colleges, universities, Butler being a private, but there's a lot of regional publics just like that it can be done at places like that. And it was, I know, one of the reasons we wanted to go out there. Speaking of cool, by the way, a couple of weeks later, we were out in the coolest place on earth, I guess, right, is Silicon Valley. Or
by definition, they define it. So
they define it that way. But give you a little bit of behind the scenes, we were at the Adobe headquarters in San Jose, and to record Future You live at Adobe EduMax, which is a big gathering. I think there were 70 plus colleges, universities there, mostly academic side of the house, who use kind of the Adobe Creative Suite in their teaching and learning. But as soon as you walk into the Adobe headquarters, Michael, as you remember, there was this cool kind of little museum almost of Adobe products. The first Adobe product, of course, being one of the first Adobe products being a PageMaker.
Yeah, we were both reminiscing around
which
that.
We were both reminiscing, because both of us got our start in publishing in student newspapers. And I remember seeing that and remember using PageMaker in high school.
Yeah, high school.
And they had this great, they had the original box there next to an Apple Macintosh computer. And I just felt for a moment there, we were transported back to, our high school and college years. So it was just kind of cool to be there. Of course, we were there for another reason, but I have a nice picture of that for when I talk about it.
Love it. All right. So what were some of the things that stood out to you? Because that was one we didn't get to debrief at the time. We had an incredible panel, we should say.
So three things here. One is, I will tell you, we focused this episode on AI. We've been doing a lot of episodes on M&A. I have a feeling now we're going to be doing a lot of episodes on AI, because I will tell you, at every stop, and I mean every stop on my book tour, I get a question about AI and higher ed. And you know what? The people, the parents, the counselors, the high school counselors, the high school teachers, the educators, they're not asking if colleges are policing cheating. They actually really don't care that much about that part of it, which I think is all the focus right now in higher ed on AI. People are worried about jobs after college, and they should be, right? We know from the latest unemployment measures for workers that those between the ages of 20 and 24, it's 9.2%. It's the highest it's been since 2015. And as we heard on that podcast that we recorded at Adobe, we had Simon Coe, who's the formerly of KPMG, of Discover, of Raymond James most recently. He was in charge of their early career opportunities and recruiting at Raymond James. As he said, employers are cutting internships. They're cutting early career programs because they're so unsure right now of headcount, and those programs are incredibly expensive. But more than that, they don't have an immediate ROI. As he said, it takes 18 months, I think, for a new college hire to really start to pay off. And so, Ryan Craig has been ringing this bell for quite some time now. what are colleges going to do if those early career rungs are knocked out?
Yeah, it's a huge question. I actually want to double click on that before hearing a few other ones that you have too, because Allison and Simon, I think, both had a great set of reflections on the need for experience in the college.
And that's Allison Salisbury,
right?
by the way,
Allison
for those
Salisbury,
who may not have heard of the podcast.
Have not heard the episode. Yep, check it out from Humanist. And they had great points about this. And then I thought Simon had some interesting reflections on the friction of why not just micro internships, which he referenced, but also internships in general have not always had the impact that perhaps they should, because employers, companies, right, have a bunch of factors. Summer break being a low time for finances, the financial services industry, as he was talking about, the amount of work it takes to actually stand up a micro internship to get a student even ready to do something interesting for a few weeks, right? And he was talking about a lot of the friction. And this is something I've been puzzling over a lot, because you just talked about companies cutting a lot of these early career pre-hire, if you will, experiences. How do you resolve that? And Allison certainly said, we can use AI for simulations and things like that. That's maybe the first 50, 60% of the answer, but you still need the experiences that are actually real and building social capital and the like. One thing I've been wondering after that episode about was, could you imagine university students or in a class, right, sort of with a particular employer, maybe a local government, whatever it is, sort of taking on problems that are not urgent and immediate, but are important to solve, and doing projects around them. So you can imagine water usage, for example, in a town. It's maybe not something we have to deal with today, but 2-3 years, we can see where this is going. Could you imagine 3 checkpoints with a manager from the town coming into a particular class and students getting a sense of the picture, building a little bit, learning the knowledge, et cetera, midpoint, getting some feedback about why their solutions are not in depth enough, and then a pitch day, right, at the end of the semester almost. Things like that would build connection, real world experience connected to real meaningful things, but also give students some of that exposure and ability perhaps to interact in the corporate environment. I'm just wondering, how much can universities sort of be creative with creating these experiences, Jeff? Because it seems to me like a really important part to really get these things to launch.
Well, and I think this brings up a good point about how this happens. And, and as you know, speaking of Ryan Craig, he's been a big fan of intermediaries that need to be created, things like Ripen and other intermediaries. We also have things like Podium Education. All these things are kind of these intermediaries. It was interesting the other day, Stephen Murray, who's head of the president CEO of Strata Education Foundation, texted me. We were talking about what's happening with internships right now. And he mentioned this need for intermediaries because employers don't want to deal with this. We heard that from Simon on the podcast. Colleges and universities, really, as Ryan always points out to me, the front door to colleges and universities around careers are career centers. They're not on the academic side. You're talking about doing these, mini projects, sprint projects within, courses. Who's going to actually do that? Is it the provost? Is it the dean? Is it individual faculty members? Who, as Ryan says, who is the employer going to go knock on the door of? And by the way, employers don't really want to deal with that. And this is where I think intermediaries come in.
It's a great point. I want to stay on that for another reason, because we all got very excited about the liberal arts on this episode at Adobe. And as you know, I have been arguing for a few years now that I think we've over-indexed on STEM at the expense of liberal arts. But I thought Allison made a very interesting point as the Davidson grad, which was liberal arts, but perhaps not taught as we have always known it. And I got to thinking about that because often when we talk about the skills you get in the liberal arts, and everyone will quickly name, critical thinking, communication, blah, blah, blah. Those skills, though, don't exist in the wild, independent of domain, the way people think that they do. So when we talk about critical thinking, for example, which itself is a basket of skills, right? It's not just one thing. And say you learn it in a history class. Well, you've been trained to do it as a history academic then. That doesn't necessarily port into the workplace. And so the redesign of liberal arts courses, I think, to actually make those skills more transferable into the world of work, that's no small task as we think about how to do this. And so one of the big things I kept thinking about was structurally, wow, like I love that we're asking faculty, how are you using AI? How would you offload things that you don't want to do anymore? Those are important questions. But I just think structurally, we need a lot more space, frankly, for universities to bring in different combinations of teams internally into their existing programs, to really rethink some of these courses and not just courses, majors, course requirements, credit hours, and things of that nature to really get from here to there. And I'll say, Simon talked about this decoupling that's happening, where at the very moment we need students to get more experiences in their college education, frankly, the employers are coming to campus less and less sort of brand conscious, if you will, or relationship conscious, because he named that they're using all these tools to just virtually recruit students. And in some ways, Jeff, I think that's a very dangerous decoupling. If I'm a college, like I want to be more integrated and connected with companies right now. If they're not even coming to my campus, I get the efficiencies, but I think that's dangerous.
Yeah, I do too, Michael. And just two other thoughts here before we go, and at least my thoughts before we go into break on the Adobe AI conversation that we had. One was from Allison Salisbury's take on being creative versus being a creator, right? She was very specific in the difference between them. As she said, being a creator is actually bringing the activation energy and the motivation to bring something into the world and then the skill set to do it. So it's, the taste to know what matters. It's the activation energy to do that. It's the problem identification on what's even building, on what you're even building. That takes kind of this idea of being a creator, not just being creative and letting someone else run the show. And then finally, Jennifer Sparrow from NYU. So that was our whole panel, Simon, Allison, and Jennifer. She noted that, even now, 60 to 70% of faculty in many places still aren't using AI in their own work.
That was shocking to me, Jeff.
While students are, right? And we see this in survey after survey after survey. I would be interested, by the way, if I was running a college right now, to do a survey on my own campus just to see what its use are. We have all these national surveys, but if I were running a college, I would want to know what's happening on my campus. And by the way, I mentioned this on a previous show as well. If I were running a college, I keep saying that, by the way, I'm kind of glad I'm not, but because I could also say these things, right? I would take the next year to essentially run a sprint of a strategic plan around AI. What are we going to do around AI? Because I think there's just so much distraction right now around what's happening with the Trump administration, what's happening with the economy. There's just the normal distractions of every day around colleges and universities. I think you have to kind of stop the clock for a minute, and you really can't, obviously. But the way you can do that is to say, okay, we're going to send off this mini group. We're going to give you X number of months, not a lot of time, to figure out what is our institutional strategy, at least in the short term, going to be around AI.
Jeff, let's double click on that, because I heard a lot of folks say, let's have 1,000 flowers bloom and just come up with ideas. But I think as long as they're in their functional silos, they're just going to come up with ideas that serve the existing silos, departmental structures, credit hours, course distribution requirements, et cetera. I think what you just said is really important. So I'm going to geek out for one moment. Steve Wheelwright, Kim Clark, academics, and actually both led different campuses of the BYU broader university system at different points. They had this set of ideas around, depending on the level of structural change, depends on the kind of team you need to bring to make those changes. So like functional teams are our departments, right? Lightweight teams are when you're bringing multiple people from different departments and they're coordinative in nature, but they're not rethinking the enterprise. What you're talking about is what they would call a heavyweight team, where they actually can rethink what are the resources and processes itself that we do in the university. And I think that is really important right now when addressing this question, because I want people bringing their functional expertise to the table. but not the loyalty to the way it's always been done, and be able to question some of those sacred cows, if you will, as they ask these questions. And I think they really, this isn't business model reinvention. So I don't think it's autonomy. I think it's within the existing institution, but I think they need that space so that they can get out of silos and ask these bigger questions that you just highlighted. One other quick nitpick, I thought Allison's point around moving creativity to creator was great. My nitpick will be, I think occupational identity is a very dangerous thing in the world of which AI could be changing whole occupations pretty severely. And I would rather us focus on what are the tasks or the things you really like doing? When are you in flow? And like help individuals start to see lots of different places in the world of work where they can show up and do those sorts of things to give them a little bit more adaptability. But that's all I got on out of the Adobe episode.
Well, Michael, we have a lot more to get to on this episode of Future You. And when we come back after this break, we're going to hit some of the big headlines that have been coming up the last couple of weeks and get to our predictions for the new year ahead. We'll be right back. Transformative teaching starts with Adobe solutions for higher education. Integrate Adobe's AI and creative tools across disciplines to help students learn more deeply, earn better grades, and stay enrolled. Teach them to communicate, collaborate, and show their value to employers in creative, visual ways. And show prospects your commitment to teaching and learning with the latest digital technologies by becoming an Adobe Creative Campus. Learn more at adobeforeducation.com.
At Butler University in Indianapolis, education is designed for impact. Students gain real-world experience through nationally recognized programs in business, pharmacy, and health sciences, and top-ranked opportunities in study abroad and first-year experience. Across 7 colleges, including the new 2-year Founders College, Butler blends academic excellence with practical application, ensuring every graduate is prepared for career success and a life of purpose. With a 98% placement rate and a campus rooted in one of the Midwest's most dynamic cities, Butler is shaping what's next. Learn more at butler.edu.
This episode of Future You is sponsored by Ascendium, a mission-driven nonprofit committed to improving learning and training systems to better serve learners from low-income backgrounds. Ascendium envisions a world where low-income learners succeed in post-secondary education and workforce training as paths to upward mobility. Ascendium's grantees are removing systemic barriers and helping to build evidence about what works so learners can achieve their career goals. For more information, visit ascendiumphilanthropy.org.
Welcome back to Future You, and we want to get to some of the headlines that have been coming up the last couple of weeks, Michael, and there's one that in some ways you created a few weeks ago by working with Steve Shulman, and you previewed for me this summer, and I really want to talk about this. So I'll let you give the headline, but maybe for our listeners also tell us who Steve is.
Yeah, so Steve, entrepreneur who for the first half of his career, he's now retired in his 80s, and the second half of his career, he created essentially a software that could financially support or consult to higher ed institutions. So spent the whole second half of his career really advising and supporting colleges, big brand names, Yale, Dartmouth, et cetera. And he saw about a year ago when Brandeis did some pretty high-profile layoffs that got a lot of attention in the Boston Globe, and then the president was out of a job and replaced by our friend Art Levine. And he basically looked at this and said, whoa, if that could happen to my alma mater, he went to Brandeis, how many other colleges are in trouble? And so he started looking in very close detail at 44 in specific mid-size institutions in New England, enroll 1,000 to 8,000 students. They're tuition dependent, private, as you said, similar in many ways to Butler. And he went deep on the finances, and he was like, wow, based on his analysis, dozens of these pretty well-known colleges that are bigger than the target that I've tended to look at, in my predictions. I've tended to look at sub 1,000 enrollment colleges, right? Or for-profit institutions with shaky value propositions, or frankly, the regional publics that you and I have written about, and the merger consolidation questions there. But he looked at these mid-sized colleges, universities with pretty big brand names and said like dozens of them are in financial trouble now. And if enrollment declines at all with what's been projected, many more could be in severe liquidity crisis over the next few years. And so it's, given the enrollment and demographic challenges we know are hitting, it's a precarious time for many more institutions than I had realized, Jeff. I think that's the headline. I can give you a little bit more color, but it's already 15 of the 44 schools that he studied are already facing serious liquidity challenges at their current levels of enrollment. And 6 are already pulling down over 12% from their unrestricted endowment. So over double, right, what you should be doing. So they're in the red in their operating budgets and pulling in quasi-endowment basically to sustain. And he does these projections then of baseline staying power and then max staying power, right? Like how long can you keep playing this game without invading illegally the restricted endowment dollars in effect, or making some major changes, right? So it's not a prediction of closure per se, because yes, colleges could get big grants, they could do massive downsizing, they could sell off big buildings. But it does seem like 38 of the 44, Jeff, said growth was their primary strategic objective. And of traditional age students, like this
it's always easier to say, Michael, right? That you're going to make more money rather than save money.
Exactly. And it's just, we know it's not going to work. Yeah. And so getting ahead of this with, frankly, I think it's a theme, we referenced you talk about it's the end of comprehensive view. This is the evidence for it. Steve just modeled out what would, if you took advantage of natural attrition year over year in staff, like what would that do to your cost basis? And it would save a ton of money for these schools. And then I said, well, what if you did that coupled with a strategic focus? Because I don't think you can just sort of do across the board, cuts that are not strategic in nature, but really said, this is who we are. We're going to focus here and we're going to downsize to where we think enrollment is going to be, as opposed to trying to hope that we maintain or grow. And frankly, a lot of the enrollment declines are already baked in because they've already declined in a lot of these New England schools. They're not rebounding. Maybe they're holding steady, but as that ripples over 4 years of 4 successive classes at that level, that's a huge enrollment drop that's hitting these schools. And I just, my takeaway is that many of them are not prepared for what's hitting at them, and it's quite striking, I think.
Yeah, Michael, I mean, just 2 quick thoughts, and then I think something that will even make it worse. And by the way, we'll put a link in the show notes to this analysis that you've written about. But one is that, as you know, I worked on that Bain issue brief on the financially sustainable university way back in 2012, when we knew that a lot of institutions were not on a sustainable financial path. I think many institutions kind of wasted the 10 years. Last decade was pretty good in terms of enrollment, in terms of stock market returns. And then, by the way, there was all that COVID money at the end of the decade. So what's interesting to me is that you're seeing these structural deficits that have happened at these colleges, universities, dipping into their endowments at a time when things were pretty good in higher ed. And now things, as we know, not only the demographic cliff, you mentioned, they think they're going to get more students, traditional students, and they also think graduate programs, online programs are going to deliver that. And I think the other headline I wanted to talk about was the impact on finances, both institutional and students, in the outcome of this negotiated rulemaking that was on the Big Beautiful Bill. You know, the Big Beautiful Bill, we've talked about this before, signed this summer, passed and signed this summer by President Trump. It included, as probably many of our listeners know, these new lifetime loan limits on professional and graduate degrees. So $200,000 for professional degrees, $100,000 on graduate degrees. Those are the lifetime limits. There's also annual limits on those as well. Now, what's interesting about this really gets into the nerdiness of federal policy making. But Congress passes the bill; they don't really get to decide on all the particulars of it. That happens during this thing called negotiated rulemaking, where they put a committee of people together to decide, okay, how are we actually going to implement this law? And a few weeks ago, the committee charged with this very important task, by the way, that I think has been lost on most colleges, of delineating between the programs that are graduate programs and those that are professional degrees. And why is that delineation important, Michael? Because one has a $200,000 cap and one has a $100,000 cap. A number of outside organizations urged the department, of course, to extend the higher loan cap for careers outside of healthcare, such as architecture, accounting, education, social work, right? They wanted those bigger loan caps. But at the end of the day, only 11 programs made it, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously medicine, pharmacy, dentistry, osteopathic medicine, law, theology made it, which is always interesting to me. But the list actually excludes things like, physician assistants, nurse practitioners, physical therapists, audiologists, which are all fast-growing programs at colleges and universities. I spoke to that group that represents them a couple of weeks ago in Indianapolis, and this was all the deans can talk about. Yeah. Because those are now going to be considered graduate degrees subject to that lower loan cap. Now, Robert Kelchin, who we both know, thinks this is all going to end up in court, but in the meantime, schools are looking at their current students. They're trying to estimate what percentage would be above that loan cap. And I think then the question becomes, do we shrink these programs, or do we lower costs, or does the private market enter? And I think everyone thinks, well, the private market will just take care of this. But as I think we've talked about before, the private market was kind of put out of business in the loan market back when the Obama administration went to direct lending. There's not a vibrant loan market right now in this area, and you can't just create one overnight, I don't think.
Yeah. Look, clearly part of the answer is going to be restarting that, and that's clearly going to be a multi-year process, to your point, right? Number one. Number two, I think it speaks to, again, the study that I wrote about in Substack and Forbes, which is, I think the big change that we made in this, or the contribution we've made, right, is a lot of folks have looked at the financial challenges through the eyes of net assets and things of that nature. We're looking just at cash. It's like really just a cash calculation at the end of the day. Can you keep the lights on? And these limits, right, directly impact the cash you can bring in the absence of a robust private student loan market. And so there's going to be an immediate hit. Now, I think this will be good long run for higher ed in the reorganization, but in the short run, it's going to be really brutal. I think it's going to be really difficult. Now, before everyone says you're all Debbie Downer, guys, there was some good news, right? I mean, there was some good news, which in the latest enrollment stats from the National Student Clearinghouse, you're always tracking those. What did they say?
Yeah, I always really look at these numbers. These are early numbers for the fall, but total enrollment is up 2% this fall over last year, with undergraduates driving most of those gains. Community colleges were way up 4%, but as you've noted and as we've noted on this podcast, and I'm sure Phil Hill will have an analysis of this pretty soon, most of that was in dual enrollment. Certificate programs, by the way, which we are going to be talking about this year on the podcast, because sometimes those are dubious in terms of their outcomes. Their salary outcomes, they went up 6.6%. Master's degrees are the only one that are falling, a little bit under 1% drop. Enrollment, just the changing demographics of higher ed, by the way, Hispanic, Black, multiracial students continue to climb. White undergraduate students continue to fall, almost 4%. Is looking at the majors, I'm always interested. Engineering is up, Michael, but what's way down? Computer science dropped 7.7% this fall, down 5.3% since 2023, which is a kind of an interesting pullback in a field that, by the way, colleges really once banked on just for nonstop growth.
So stay there, Jeff, because I think what that signals is that families are wisening up to the fact that the biggest unemployment, computer science majors, right, who graduated.
AI
so they quickly figured it out, right? And so it's not that there won't be any computer scientists, but fewer than needed before. So that's one. And two, fascinating to see these credential or certificate programs continue to rise. I mean, this is like a many-year trend at this point, but often they pay less, right, in terms of to college coffers than the degree programs and these master programs that have really buoyed a lot of institutions that we were talking about getting undercut by those loan limits. Frankly, the 44 colleges that I was talking about, I suspect a lot of them had online masters, right, as one of the things that they were considering to hold themselves up. That looks like that is increasingly slipping away, and I suspect will drop even faster once these loan limits are actually in place, because this is still before this was before the negotiated rulemaking and the bill had even passed, right, Jeff?
Yeah. So, Michael, as we head into the end of the episode here, it's almost 2026. So let's do some of our predictions. We're going to do this rapid fire mainly because maybe if the less information we give, maybe people won't hold us to these.
Oh, good. Yeah.
In 2026, because what happens with predictions often. So I'm kind of curious. What are your 2 or 3 predictions for higher ed?
You sprung this on me, Jeff. I wasn't ready, but okay, here I go. Number one, I think no institution signs the initial version of the Trump compact for higher ed. I think no one signs it. I do think that compact keeps morphing in 2026. We'll see if anyone gets to a place where they could actually sign it, though. Secondly, I do think Harvard and Trump will come to a settlement in 2026, but I think there'll, just like with the ceasefire and everything else it seems that Trump touches, there'll be continued noise as Harvard will dig some holes and then they'll get some rounds of ire from Trump. And then third, we've seen, just as we're recording this, a huge amount of reshuffling where, no, they haven't closed the Department of Education, but they've moved whole functions to Department of Labor and elsewhere and so forth. I'm not sure that is actually going to change that much in the day-to-day of colleges when it's all said and done. But I do think it's going to create a lot more cost and confusion in the short run, because who the heck do you go to when something goes awry or you have a question around a reg that, Jeff, didn't actually change just because it changed into a different department? Turns out you're not actually changing that.
Well, and it seems like you're just reorganizing the deck chairs here.
Oh, this is deck chair. This is Titanic deck chair 101.
Right. But by the way, the department will still be there in a couple of years. So I'm not quite sure what this is really achieving.
I agree. All right. What are your predictions?
Okay. So one, we are going to see a lot more M&A in 2026. And it's not just because we probably want to record more episodes about it, or maybe our listeners don't want us to record any more episodes about it. But I think what you just laid out around finances means that I think a number of institutions will be much more serious about it. This will go beyond a thing that, like, Northeastern is not going to be buying up more universities. I think we're going to see a lot more of the types that we saw with Gannon University, for example, smaller colleges merging and acquiring other colleges in their backyard or nearby. So that's one thing. Second, in 2 pieces of surprise news here, I think one is Jim Ryan goes back to UVA. Now, I don't know if that will actually happen, because he actually did say that he was planning on retiring anyway. But wouldn't that be fun? Where he, in the spirit of Teresa Sullivan, who did the same thing, where she was fired by the board and then came back as president. As you know, Virginia is getting a Democratic governor, and there's been a little tussle between her and the current Republican administration in Virginia that she thinks it should wait until she gets to appoint new members of the board to appoint a new president there. Wouldn't it be fascinating to see Jim Ryan come back to UVA as president? And then finally, speaking of political tussles, I have a feeling that after a year of Trump and higher ed, I have a feeling there's going to be other villains for him in 2026. He tends to move on to other issues. And I think he feels like he has gotten all the squeeze he can out of higher ed. He's gotten all the news he can out of higher ed. And I think they're going to move on to other villains. And I think higher ed will not be in the news as much when it comes to the Trump administration.
So he's going to spike the proverbial football and say, I did what I set out to do, and let's move on.
Moving on.
All right.
I think that will happen. I'm sure higher ed will be happy if that does happen, but who knows who the next villain will be.
Oh, well, we'll stay tuned for all of it because the news cycle will definitely keep us informed. So with all that said, huge thank you to all of you, our listeners, over this first half of our season. And we look forward to talking to you, seeing you in 2026 as you hold our feet to the fire on these predictions and more. Well, we've got a ton of great episodes coming up, and we can't wait to continue to talk to you about the future of higher education and our own learning journeys through it. We'll see you next time.